A woman stands frozen in December 1944, watching bread fall into a garbage bin. It is fresh, white, barely touched. Her hands tremble. In Tokyo, her children would have fought over that single piece. Here, in a Texas internment camp, it is waste. She whispers 5 words that capture the impossible contradiction of this war. I would do anything for that. Crystal City, Texas. December 1944. Tomiko Nakamura, 34 years old, steps off a transport bus into what Americans call an internment camp, and what she knows only as captivity. Her body tells the story of the previous year better than any words could. She has lost 23 pounds. Her cheekbones protrude sharply. Her hands shake with a tremor that began during the final months in Tokyo and never quite stopped. She is one of approximately 300 Japanese nationals arriving at Crystal City Family Internment Camp as part of a prisoner exchange facilitated by the MS Gripsholm, a Swedish diplomatic vessel that has become the unlikely ferry between 2 worlds at war. The journey that brought her here began in Tokyo in early 1944, when the average Japanese urban resident was subsisting on approximately 1,700 calories per day, a figure that would continue to drop as American bombers tightened their grip on supply lines. Tomiko lived through the implementation of neighborhood rationing associations, the distribution of substitute foods that bore only a passing resemblance to actual nutrition, and the gradual realization that Japan was not winning this war. Rice gave way to millet, then to sweet potato vines, then to mixtures of acorn flour and sawdust that left children crying with stomach cramps. By summer, her family was eating twice a day instead of 3 times. By autumn, once a day was a victory. Her evacuation to Japanese-controlled Manchuria in September 1944 was supposed to be an escape, a government program moving vulnerable civilians away from anticipated American firebombing. Instead, it became a different kind of nightmare. The Manchurian infrastructure was collapsing under Soviet pressure from the north and Chinese resistance from within. Food was scarce, security non-existent, diseases rampant. When the opportunity came for a prisoner exchange, Tomiko took it, not because she wanted to become an enemy captive, but because the alternative was death in a frozen railway station somewhere in northeast China. The MS Gripsholm carried her across the Pacific in November 1944, a strange voyage where Japanese civilians, German diplomats, and a handful of Italian nationals shared cramped quarters under the protection of Swedish neutrality. The ship provided basic meals more than she had eaten in months, but the journey was marked by fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that she was heading toward the country that was systematically destroying her homeland. Now she stands in Texas, in a place that defies every expectation she had constructed during the voyage. Crystal City Family Internment Camp is not a prison in the sense she understood. There are fences, yes, guard towers with armed sentries, but there are also family cottages, a school building, agricultural plots, and a communal dining facility that looks more substantial than anything she saw in Manchuria. The other internees, a mixture of Japanese, German, and Italian families, move about with a routine familiarity that suggests this place operates under rules very different from military captivity. An administrator, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Eleanor Bradford, processes the new arrivals with bureaucratic efficiency, tempered by what seems to be genuine, if somewhat detached, concern. She explains the camp structure through a translator. The facility operates under Department of Justice authority, not military command. It houses approximately 3,000 internees at its peak capacity. Families are kept together when possible. Children attend school. Adults work in agriculture, camp maintenance, or light manufacturing. Letters may be written and received subject to censorship. And then the detail that seems almost surreal. Meals are provided in accordance with Geneva Convention standards for prisoners of war. Tomiko does not fully understand what this means until her first dinner. The dining hall is a long wooden structure with rows of tables and benches. It smells of cooked food, a scent so overwhelming after months of near starvation that several of the newly arrived women stop at the entrance, momentarily unable to process what their senses are reporting. Tomiko takes a tray and moves through a serving line, an experience foreign enough that she mimics the movements of those ahead of her. A server, an American civilian employee, places items on her tray with mechanical efficiency. A portion of canned meat, processed but recognizable. 2 slices of white bread. Actual wheat bread with a soft texture that seems impossible. A scoop of mashed potatoes made from dehydrated flakes, but still more substantial than anything she has eaten since 1943. A portion of canned green beans. A cup of reconstituted powdered milk. A small dish of canned peaches and syrup. She carries the tray to a table and sits, staring at the food. Around her, other newly arrived women are having similar reactions. Some cry quietly. Others eat with a mechanical urgency born of long deprivation. Tomiko picks up the bread, feeling its weight, its softness. In Tokyo, a piece of bread this size would have been divided among 4 people. Here, she has been given 2 pieces as a side item to a full meal. The psychological dissonance is overwhelming. This food comes from the enemy, from the country that is firebombing Japanese cities and sinking supply convoys and pushing inexorably toward the home islands. Yet it is being provided not as charity but as legal obligation, an implementation of international agreements about prisoner treatment. She is supposed to receive rations comparable to what American military depot troops receive. The implications of this are staggering. America can afford to feed its enemies at the same level it feeds its own soldiers. This is not mercy. This is a demonstration of absolute material superiority. She eats slowly, her stomach unable to handle the sudden influx of fats and proteins after months of deprivation. Other women are less cautious and will spend the night vomiting, their bodies in revolt against the sudden abundance. But the physical challenge is minor compared to the psychological one. Every bite carries guilt. Her sister is in Osaka, in a city that will be firebombed within months, subsisting on rations that have fallen below 1,400 calories per day. Her nieces are children facing malnutrition that will stunt their growth permanently. And she is here, in enemy captivity, eating white bread and canned peaches. The meal ends, and this is when Tomiko sees something that will haunt her for the rest of her life. American staff members begin clearing tables. They move with practiced efficiency, scraping plates into large garbage bins positioned throughout the hall. And Tomiko watches, unable to look away, as food is thrown away. Half-eaten slices of bread, portions of meat barely touched, canned peaches left in their syrup, an entire tray filled with food that someone took but did not finish, scraped wholesale into the trash. The woman sitting next to her, Keiko, another recent arrival from the Gripsholm exchange, makes a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Tomiko reaches out, gripping Keiko's arm, both to comfort and to steady herself. They watch in silence as more food disappears into the bins. Food that is still clean, still edible, being treated as garbage because there is so much more where it came from. Tomiko leans close to Keiko and whispers, in Japanese, 5 words that encapsulate everything she is feeling. I would do anything for that. Not just the food, the casual certainty of abundance, the privilege of waste, the power to discard what others would die to obtain. She would do anything for that. And simultaneously she would do anything to unknow what this waste represents about the war, about Japan's chances, about the fundamental asymmetry between the nation that must conserve every grain of rice and the nation that throws away bread. The concept that drives Tomiko's horror has a name in Japanese, mottainai. It is often translated as regret over waste, but the word carries deeper spiritual and cultural weight. Mottainai encompasses respect for resources, acknowledgement of the labor that produced them, and a Buddhist-influenced recognition of the interconnectedness of all things. To waste food is not merely inefficient. It is a moral failure, a demonstration of disrespect for the farmers who grew it, the workers who processed it, and the fundamental gift of sustenance itself. Japanese children are raised with mottainai as a core value. Tomiko's own mother made her finish every grain of rice in her bowl, explaining that each grain represented the labor of 88 steps from planting to harvest. Food waste was unthinkable, not because of scarcity, but because of values. And now, in this American camp, she is confronted with a culture that apparently does not share this value, or at least does not apply it in the same way. What Tomiko does not know, cannot know from her position inside the camp, is that America itself is engaged in a massive campaign against food waste at this very moment. The United States Department of Agriculture has plastered posters across the nation declaring food is a weapon, don't waste it. Newspapers run articles about conservation. Radio programs feature segments on stretching rations and using leftovers. Victory gardens, home vegetable plots cultivated by approximately 20 million American families, have become a patriotic duty. The government has implemented rationing systems for sugar, meat, butter, coffee, and other staples, asking civilians to accept modest deprivation so that military forces can be adequately supplied. But there is a vast difference between asking a population accustomed to abundance to accept modest rationing and the existential food crisis facing Japan. American civilians in 1944 are being asked to do without second helpings and luxury items. Japanese civilians are being asked to survive on starvation rations while watching their children's bodies consume themselves. The American Conservation Campaign is about efficiency and fairness in distribution. The Japanese crisis is about the fundamental collapse of a supply system under military pressure. And in places like Crystal City, in military facilities and POW camps across America, the food waste continues despite the conservation campaigns. Not because of deliberate cruelty, but because institutional food service inherently generates waste. Meals are prepared in bulk. Portion sizes are standardized. Individual preferences vary. The infrastructure is designed for abundance, and abundance creates surplus, and surplus becomes waste. For the American staff at Crystal City, the post-meal cleanup is routine, unremarkable, a mundane part of institutional operation. For the Japanese women watching, it is a daily confrontation with the reality of their situation. They are captives of a nation so materially superior that it can afford to be careless with food while their own homeland starves. Tomiko returns to her assigned barracks that night, a small family cottage she shares with 3 other women. The cottages are basic but weatherproof, heated against the Texas winter, furnished with beds and minimal storage. By the standards of wartime internment, they are humane. By the standards of Tokyo in 1944, they are almost luxurious. She cannot sleep. Her mind circles back to the garbage bins, to the bread falling, to the casual scrape of a spoon pushing edible food into trash. She thinks about her sister's children, about the neighborhood association ration distribution in Osaka, about the old woman on her street who died in October, officially of heart failure, but really of slow starvation wrapped in official euphemisms. The other women in the cottage are having similar thoughts. They talk in low voices in Japanese, knowing that while their letters are censored, their private conversations inside the barracks are not monitored. One woman, older, suggests that they should be grateful for adequate food regardless of its source. Another, younger, argues that accepting enemy generosity is a betrayal of those suffering at home. A third points out that refusing to eat would accomplish nothing except their own deaths, which would also be a betrayal, a waste of the survival opportunity that others did not receive. Tomiko says little, but she makes a decision. The next morning after breakfast, she wraps 2 slices of bread in a cloth and hides them in her small trunk. Not because she is hungry. The meals are adequate, more than adequate, but because the act of preserving food, of refusing to let it become waste, is the only way she can maintain some connection to the values that defined her life before the war. She is not the only one. Over the following weeks, as the newly arrived internees adapt to camp routine, a pattern emerges. Women hoard food, bread mainly because it keeps relatively well, also crackers, portions of canned goods, sometimes fruit. They hide it in their cottages, wrapped carefully, stored away with an intensity that makes no practical sense given that their next meal is guaranteed. Mrs. Bradford discovers the hoarding during a routine inspection in January 1945. She finds Tomiko's stash, perhaps 2 weeks' worth of bread in various states of staleness, hidden in a trunk beneath clothing. Bradford is confused rather than angry. The women are being fed adequately. Medical checks show that most are slowly gaining back weight lost before arrival. There is no rational reason for this behavior. She sits down with Tomiko, with a translator present, and asks directly, "Why are you hiding food? You are receiving 3 meals a day. You are not going hungry. Why is this necessary?" Tomiko struggles to explain through the translator. She tries to convey mottainai, the concept that waste is spiritually wrong, that preserving food is a moral imperative, regardless of whether you currently need it. She tries to explain that watching food thrown away every day is psychologically unbearable when she knows her family is starving. She tries to make Bradford understand that this is not about current hunger but about memory, about maintaining dignity in the face of abundance that feels like humiliation. Bradford listens, tries to understand, and ultimately cannot quite bridge the gap. She is a kind woman, genuinely concerned with internee welfare, operating within a system designed to be as humane as wartime captivity allows. But she has never been hungry. Not really. Not in the way that rewrites your relationship with food permanently. She has never lived in a society where every grain of rice carries spiritual weight. She comes from a culture where abundance is normal and waste, while discouraged by wartime campaigns, is ultimately accepted as an inevitable byproduct of plenty. She makes a note in her report. Internees displaying food hoarding behavior due to previous deprivation recommend psychological observation, but no disciplinary action. And she allows Tomiko to keep the bread, understanding that this is not a security threat, but a trauma response. The incident crystallizes something for Tomiko. The Americans are not cruel. In many ways, they are scrupulously, almost mechanically, fair. The Geneva Convention is being followed to the letter. Families are kept together. Children are educated. Medical care is provided. Violence is absent. But the kindness itself becomes a form of power, a demonstration that America can afford to treat its enemies well, because the outcome of the war is already determined. Across the country at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, approximately 2,700 Japanese military prisoners of war are having a parallel but distinct experience. These are soldiers captured in the Pacific Theater, men who surrendered or were captured wounded, who carry the additional burden of having failed the warrior code that was supposed to make surrender unthinkable. Fort McCoy operates under the same Geneva Convention standards as Crystal City. The prisoners receive adequate rations, medical care, housing. They work in forestry and agriculture, labor that is permitted under international law. And they, too, witness the American abundance, the casual waste that occurs in institutional food service. But their reaction is filtered through a different cultural framework. For the male military prisoners, the shame of capture is compounded by the reality of their captors' material superiority. Some initially refuse to eat American food, viewing it as a form of collaboration. This stance lasts only as long as starvation threatens, usually a matter of days. Survival overrides ideology, but the psychological burden remains. They are being kept alive by the enemy, fed better than many Japanese civilians, given medical care that exceeds what they received in their own military. The gender dimension is significant. Tomiko and the women at Crystal City process the experience through frameworks of family, community, and moral economy. The soldiers at Fort McCoy process it through frameworks of honor, military hierarchy, and national shame. The women feel guilt about surviving comfortably while family members suffer. The men feel shame about surviving at all, compounded by the knowledge that their survival is entirely dependent on enemy restraint. Both groups are confronting the same fundamental reality. America has won the material war so decisively that it can afford to be generous to its captives. This generosity is not primarily about morality, though moral considerations play a role. It is strategic. Treating prisoners well encourages surrender, undermines enemy morale, and provides leverage in diplomatic negotiations. It also protects American prisoners held by enemy forces, at least in theory, by establishing precedents of reciprocal treatment. But in the Pacific Theater, this reciprocity has broken down almost entirely. Japanese military forces treat captured Allied soldiers with systematic brutality that violates every provision of the Geneva Convention. The mortality rate for Allied prisoners in Japanese captivity approaches 27%, compared to 1 to 3% for Axis prisoners in Allied captivity. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the countless camps where prisoners are starved, beaten, worked to death. These create a moral asymmetry that complicates every interaction. American guards at camps like Fort McCoy and Crystal City are aware of this asymmetry. They know what is happening to American prisoners in Japanese hands. Some struggle with the requirement to treat Japanese captives humanely when their countrymen are being tortured and starved. Others take a pragmatic view. Following international law regardless of enemy behavior is what separates civilization from barbarism, and some simply follow orders without philosophical wrestling, treating prisoner management as a job to be done according to regulation. Private Robert Miller, 19 years old, from a farm outside Billings, Montana, is one of the guards assigned to Crystal City in early 1945. He comes from a background of hard work and modest plenty, the kind of rural American existence where food is abundant, but not taken for granted because everyone knows the labor required to produce it. His family runs cattle and grows wheat. He understands agriculture, understands the work that goes into feeding people. But he does not understand the Japanese women who watch him with an intensity he finds unsettling. He is not cruel. He follows regulations scrupulously. He does not harass or intimidate. He simply does his job, which includes monitoring meal times, ensuring order, and assisting with the mundane logistics of institutional food service. One afternoon in February 1945, during lunch cleanup, Miller is eating an orange, a small luxury that has been distributed to the guards. The orange is slightly bruised, brown spots on the skin suggesting it was dropped or roughly handled during transport. He takes a few bites, finds the flavor affected by the bruising, and tosses the remaining half into a nearby garbage bin. Tomiko is 10 feet away, clearing tables. She stops, staring at the discarded orange. Miller notices her staring, notices the expression on her face, something between horror and desperate longing. He is confused. It was a bruised orange. There are more oranges. Why is this woman looking at garbage as if he has committed an atrocity? A translator, a bilingual Japanese-American woman employed by the camp administration, observes the interaction. She approaches Miller and quietly explains. In Japan right now, an orange would be an impossible luxury. Fruit is for the sick and dying, if available at all. The internees come from circumstances where a bruised orange would be carefully peeled, every section consumed, the peel perhaps dried and used for flavoring or tea. Throwing it away, especially half-eaten, is incomprehensible waste. Miller tries to understand. He is not insensitive, not deliberately wasteful. He simply inhabits a world where a bruised orange is not worth finishing when there are fresh ones available. The translator tries to explain mottainai, the concept that waste is morally wrong, that every piece of food represents labor and life, and deserves respect. Miller nods, but the understanding is intellectual, not visceral. He cannot feel what Tomiko feels, because he has never lived what she has lived. He makes an effort after that. He finishes his meals more completely, scrapes his plate more carefully, but he also knows that his individual behavior is irrelevant. The institutional waste will continue because the system is designed for abundance. Meals are prepared for maximum capacity, not actual consumption. Safety margins ensure that no one goes hungry, which means surplus is inevitable. And surplus, in a system built for efficiency rather than conservation, becomes waste. For Tomiko, the orange incident is one moment in a daily accumulation of small psychological wounds. Each meal brings food. Each cleanup brings waste. The contradiction never resolves. She is eating better than she has in 2 years, gaining back weight, recovering physical strength, and she is watching food thrown away every day. Food that would save lives in Osaka or Tokyo or any of 100 cities where people are dying slow deaths by incremental starvation. She writes a letter to her sister in March, knowing it will be censored, choosing words carefully. We are adequately housed and fed. The conditions are humane. I am not suffering. Please do not worry about me. What she wants to write but cannot. I am eating 3 meals a day while you starve. I watch bread thrown into garbage bins. I am safe while the Americans firebomb our cities. I am a traitor to our shared suffering, preserved by the enemy while you endure the consequences of a war I am no longer fighting. I hate this. I hate myself. I hate that survival feels like betrayal. The censored letter reaches Osaka in May, months after sending, delivered through neutral diplomatic channels. Her sister reads it, notes the careful language, understands what is not being said. The letter becomes evidence in a quiet internal propaganda campaign, whispered conversations about how America treats its prisoners. For some, it reinforces the sense that America is barbaric, that the reported kindness is a lie. For others, it raises disturbing questions about the narratives they have been told, about whether Japan can win a war against a nation that can afford to feed its enemies well. Inside Crystal City, the community of internees develops complex internal divisions. The newly arrived women, those who came from Japan or Japanese-controlled territories in 1944 and 1945, share Tomiko's experience of starvation and recent trauma. But there are also Japanese-American families, Nisei second-generation immigrants, who were rounded up from California, Arizona, and other Western states under Executive Order 9066. These families have never experienced the deprivation of wartime Japan. Their children are American-born, English-speaking, culturally hybrid. Tensions emerge along these lines. The Japan-born women view the Japanese Americans with suspicion, seeing them as contaminated by American culture, insufficiently loyal to the homeland. The Japanese Americans view the Japan-born women with a mixture of pity and incomprehension, unable to fully grasp the trauma of starvation they describe, frustrated by the rigid nationalism some display. Arguments break out over politics, over loyalty, over how to interpret the camp experience. One recurring debate centers on gratitude. Should they be grateful for adequate treatment? The Japan-born women largely say no, arguing that they should have never been imprisoned in the first place, that adequate food does not erase the fundamental injustice of captivity. The Japanese Americans are more divided, some arguing that compared to the alternative possibilities, compared to rumors of what happens in military POW camps elsewhere, Crystal City is humane and deserves acknowledgement as such. Tomiko mostly stays out of these arguments. She has no energy for ideological debates. She focuses on routine, work assignments in the camp garden, meals, letters, the small rituals that make captivity bearable. But she cannot escape the daily confrontation with waste, cannot unsee what she has seen, cannot unfeel what the discarded food represents. December 1944 becomes December 1945. The war grinds through its final year. News reaches the camp in fragments, censored and delayed but impossible to completely suppress. Germany surrenders in May. The Pacific War intensifies through summer. Rumors circulate about some massive new weapon used against Japanese cities in August, though details are scarce and contradictory. Then, in mid-August, the stunning announcement, Japan has surrendered. The reaction in Crystal City is complex. Relief that the killing has stopped. Grief over Japan's defeat. Fear about what happens next. The internees are enemy nationals in a country that has just won total victory. Will they be released? Deported? Prosecuted? Nobody knows. Mrs. Bradford tries to provide reassurance. The war is over. Repatriation will be arranged. Families will be kept together. But the timeline is unclear. Processing thousands of internees, arranging transportation to a devastated Japan, coordinating with occupation authorities. This will take months. Christmas 1945 arrives, the first Christmas after victory. The camp administration, perhaps out of genuine goodwill or perhaps out of bureaucratic routine, arranges a special holiday meal. Turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, green beans, rolls, pie. For the American staff, it is a traditional celebration, a momentary restoration of normalcy. For the Japanese internees, it is surreal, almost obscene. Tomiko sits at a table with Keiko and two other women, staring at a plate piled with more food than she has seen at one meal in years. The turkey is moist, properly cooked, seasoned. The pie is sweetened with real sugar, not substitutes. Everything about this meal speaks of abundance reclaimed, of a nation that has won and can now celebrate without deprivation. She eats mechanically, and then, without warning, she begins to cry. Not quietly. Sobs that shake her shoulders, tears that she cannot control, grief and rage and guilt and exhaustion pouring out. Keiko reaches over, grips her hand, says nothing because there is nothing to say. Later, after the meal, after she has regained some composure, Keiko speaks quietly. This is how they show they have won. Not with cruelty, but with this. With abundance. With the ability to give us a feast while our cities burn. They do not need to beat us. They can simply feed us and let us understand what that means. The observation is accurate. American power in this moment is not primarily demonstrated through violence, though violence has been overwhelming. It is demonstrated through the capacity to sustain, to supply, to produce more than is needed, and then to be generous with the surplus. This is the power that won the war. The industrial and agricultural capacity that could simultaneously field millions of soldiers, supply allies across oceans, and feed populations including captive enemies. Repatriation begins in early 1946. Tomiko is processed in March, part of a large group being returned to Japan via military transport. She has spent approximately 15 months in American captivity. She has gained back the weight she lost, recovered physical health, and acquired a psychological burden she will carry for the rest of her life. The transport ship arrives in Yokohama in April 1946. The city is devastated, firebombed into rubble, barely functional. The occupation is underway, American forces everywhere providing basic order and beginning the reconstruction process. Food is scarce. The ration system has collapsed. Black markets operate openly. Children beg. People die of malnutrition and disease in numbers that overwhelm the improvised medical facilities. Tomiko finds her sister living in a partially destroyed building, sharing 2 rooms with 4 other families. Her sister is emaciated, hollow-eyed, aged a decade in the 2 years since they last saw each other. Her nieces are alive but malnourished, their growth stunted, their bodies marked by deprivation that will affect their health permanently. They embrace crying, grateful for survival against terrible odds. And then her sister asks the question Tomiko has been dreading. How was it? Did they starve you? Did they beat you? How did you survive? Tomiko makes a decision in that moment. She lies. She says the camp was difficult, food scarce, treatment harsh. She cannot tell the truth, cannot explain that she ate 3 meals a day while her sister starved, that she watched bread thrown away, that the Americans were scrupulously humane according to their legal obligations. The truth would create an unbridgeable gap, would make her survival feel like betrayal, would force her sister to grapple with the knowledge that captivity in America was safer and better fed than freedom in Japan. So she lies, and the lie becomes the story she tells for decades, the official narrative of her wartime experience. Only much later, in her 70s, when the war has receded into history and the emotional landscape has shifted, does she begin to speak publicly about what really happened? The post-war years bring slow recovery. Japan rebuilds under American occupation, transforming from devastated enemy to Cold War ally. Food security gradually improves. By the early 1950s, acute starvation has ended, though poverty and malnutrition remain widespread. Tomiko marries, has children, builds a life in the ruins of the old one. But certain behaviors never change. She never wastes food. Every meal is finished completely. Every scrap is saved, repurposed, used. Her children grow up with a mother who is obsessed with clean plates, who becomes visibly distressed at waste, who hoards preserved goods in quantities that make no sense in the context of post-war abundance. They do not understand. They were born after the war, into a Japan that is recovering, modernizing, gradually becoming prosperous. They have never been hungry, not really. They are puzzled and sometimes embarrassed by their mother's intensity about food, by her strange hoarding habits, by the way she flinches when they scrape leftovers into trash. In 1982, at age 72, Tomiko gives her first recorded interview about her wartime experience. An oral history project is collecting testimonies from survivors, and she finally agrees to participate. The interviewer asks about her time in American captivity, expecting stories of hardship and mistreatment. Instead, Tomiko describes the food, the abundance, the waste, the daily confrontation with a system so materially superior that it could afford to be careless. She explains the phrase that has haunted her for nearly 40 years. I would do anything for that. The interviewer is confused. It sounds like the camp treated you well, the interviewer says. Why does it sound like trauma? Tomiko struggles to explain. The trauma was not from cruelty but from contradiction, from being preserved by the enemy while her people died, from having her survival purchased with adequate rations while her family starved, from witnessing abundance that proved how decisively Japan had lost, not just militarily, but economically, industrially, culturally. The waste told us we had lost, she says. Not just the war, but the moral argument. How do you claim spiritual superiority when you are starving, and your enemy is throwing away bread? The interview becomes part of a growing historiography, examining prisoner of war experiences in World War II. Scholars begin to pay attention to the asymmetries, to the vast differences in how different nations treated captives. The statistics are stark and undeniable. Allied prisoners in Japanese captivity, 27% mortality, systematic brutality, violations of every convention, Axis prisoners in Allied captivity, 1 to 3% mortality, general compliance with international law, adequate food and medical care. These numbers raise difficult questions. Why such different outcomes? The answer is partly about resources. Japan, under blockade and strategic bombing, genuinely struggled to feed its own population and military, let alone prisoners. But resource scarcity does not fully explain the systematic cruelty, the brutality that went beyond neglect into active torture and murder. The explanation also involves culture, military doctrine, and the specific ideology of wartime Japanese militarism that viewed surrender as disgraceful and treated prisoners, including enemy prisoners, with contempt. American and British forces, operating from positions of material abundance and within a legal framework that emphasized humane treatment, produced very different outcomes. But the humanitarian treatment of prisoners by Allied forces was not purely altruistic. It was also strategic. Well-treated prisoners provided intelligence. Humane conditions encouraged surrender, which saved lives on both sides. Compliance with international law protected Allied prisoners through the principle of reciprocity, though this protection was limited in the Pacific theater given Japanese non-compliance. And demonstrating restraint and legality strengthened the moral claims of Allied nations, reinforcing the narrative that this was a war of civilization against barbarism. For individual captives like Tomiko, these strategic calculations were invisible. She experienced the result: adequate food, humane treatment, survival. But the experience came wrapped in psychological complexity that simple survival narratives cannot capture. She was grateful to be alive. She was ashamed to have survived comfortably. She was resentful of the power dynamics that made her survival dependent on enemy generosity. She carried guilt about being fed while her family starved. All of these feelings coexisted, contradictory and unresolved. In 1990, Tomiko's daughter Michiko, born in 1950 into post-war Japan, asks her mother a direct question. They are sorting through old papers, and Michiko has found her mother's internment documents, identification papers from Crystal City. The question, why did you not hate them? After everything, after the bombs and the war and the captivity, why do you speak about the Americans without hatred? Tomiko thinks for a long time before answering. How do you hate someone who feeds you when you are starving? Even if you are their prisoner? Even if they are destroying your country? The Americans at the camp were not cruel. They followed their rules. They gave me food. How do I hate that? But she continues, and yet I do hate it. Not them exactly, but what it represented. Their abundance was a weapon more devastating than bombs because it showed us how completely we had lost. Every meal, every piece of wasted bread was proof that we could not win, proof that we had challenged a nation that could afford to feed its enemies well. That is what I remember. Not beatings or torture, but bread falling into trash. That is the image that haunts me. Michiko does not fully understand, cannot fully understand without having lived the experience, but she begins to grasp the complexity. Her mother's wartime experience was simultaneously salvation and humiliation, survival and trauma, gratitude and resentment. It cannot be simplified into a story of either American benevolence or Japanese suffering. It is both and neither, a tangle of contradictions that resists easy interpretation. Tomiko dies in 1998 at age 88. Her children, sorting through her belongings, find a diary that she kept sporadically during the war and post-war years. Most entries are mundane, daily records of routine events. But one entry, dated December 15, 1944, stands out. Watched American throw away bread today. It was clean, fresh. He tossed it like garbage. My children in Tokyo would fight over that bread. I hate him. I hate myself for wanting it. I hate this war that made food into weapons. I hate that I am alive and fed while my family starves. I hate that their generosity feels like mockery. I hate that I am grateful. I hate everything about this. The diary is eventually donated to the National Archives as part of the documentation of wartime internment experiences. It becomes part of the historical record, a primary source that complicates simple narratives about American treatment of Japanese nationals during the war. The story of Crystal City and similar camps is part of a larger history of prisoner of war treatment in World War II, a history marked by extreme variation depending on which nations were involved. German prisoners in American camps generally experience conditions similar to Japanese internees: adequate food, humane treatment, compliance with Geneva Convention standards. British camps holding German prisoners operated under similar principles. The Western European theater, for all its violence, maintained relatively consistent standards for prisoner treatment. The Pacific theater was different. Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on fighting to the death and its contempt for surrender, produced systematic brutality toward prisoners that shocked Allied nations and later became central evidence in war crimes prosecutions. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the countless camps where prisoners were starved and worked to death, these created a moral asymmetry that profoundly shaped post-war perceptions. This asymmetry makes stories like Tomiko's difficult to integrate into broader narratives. How do we acknowledge that America treated its captives humanely, while Japan committed systematic atrocities without turning the story into simple propaganda? How do we recognize the genuine humanity of camp administrators like Mrs. Bradford while acknowledging that the system they administered was still one of forced captivity? How do we honor the complexity of individual experience while documenting the larger patterns of national behavior? These questions matter because they shape how we understand the war, how we assign moral responsibility, and how we think about the relationship between ethics and power. America's relatively humane treatment of prisoners was enabled by material abundance. It is easier to follow ethical standards when you have resources to spare. Japan's brutal treatment of prisoners was partly driven by resource scarcity, but also by ideological choices about the value of enemy lives. Distinguishing between constrained choices and moral choices is essential but difficult. For Tomiko, these historiographical debates were abstract. Her experience was concrete and personal. She lived through starvation in Tokyo, captivity in Texas, and post-war reconstruction in Yokohama. She raised children, worked, survived into old age, and she never forgot the bread falling into trash, the image that crystallized for her the meaning of the war and of Japan's defeat. The phrase she whispered in December 1944, "I would do anything for that," becomes in retrospect a kind of epitaph for Japan's wartime experience. The anything was not hypothetical. Japan did do anything, mobilizing total society for total war, sacrificing civilian welfare, accepting mass starvation, fighting long past any rational hope of victory. And it was not enough, could never have been enough, against an enemy that could afford to waste bread. Tomiko's story is one of millions, one individual thread in a vast tapestry of wartime suffering and survival. But it captures something essential about the nature of that war, about the asymmetry between industrial powers and resource-constrained nations, about the way material abundance translates into military and political power, and about the psychological cost of surviving when survival comes at the hands of enemies. The wasted food at Crystal City was not cruelty. It was routine, the inevitable byproduct of institutional food service operating from a position of abundance. But for the women who watched it, who came from circumstances where every grain of rice had value, where children died of starvation while adults tried to maintain dignity through rationing systems that failed, the waste was unbearable. It demonstrated with brutal clarity the fundamental reality of the war. America had won not through superior courage or moral righteousness, but through overwhelming material capacity. And that capacity was so great that it could afford to be careless, to throw away what others would die to obtain, to treat abundance as normal and waste as regrettable but inevitable. This is what Tomiko understood, watching bread fall into trash in December 1944. This is what haunted her for 54 years until her death in 1998. Not the experience of captivity itself, which was humane by any reasonable standard, but the meaning of that captivity, the demonstration of absolute defeat, the knowledge that Japan had challenged a power so vastly superior that even its waste was abundance. The historical legacy of prisoner treatment in World War II continues to shape international law and humanitarian standards. The Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded in 1949, incorporating lessons learned from wartime violations. The principle that prisoners must be treated humanely, fed adequately, protected from violence, has become a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, even if compliance remains imperfect. But beyond the legal frameworks and diplomatic agreements, there are individual stories like Tomiko's, stories that complicate and humanize the historical record. She was neither hero nor victim in any simple sense. She survived. She carried trauma. She lived a long life marked by memories she could neither fully escape nor fully articulate. Her experience resists simplification into propaganda for either side, instead offering a window into the psychological reality of war as experienced by civilians caught in circumstances they did not create and could not control. The bread falling into trash remains, decades later, a powerful symbol. It represents waste, yes, but also abundance, power, asymmetry, defeat, survival, and the strange psychological burden of being kept alive by enemies while your own people die. It is a small moment, unremarkable to the person throwing it away, traumatic to the person watching. And in that gap between perspectives lies the essential tragedy of war, the impossibility of shared understanding across vast divides of experience and power. Tomiko Nakamura outlived the war by 53 years. She saw Japan rebuild, prosper, become one of the world's most successful economies. She saw her children and grandchildren grow up in peace and abundance, never knowing the hunger that defined her middle years. She lived long enough to see the war become history, distant enough that younger generations could study it without personal memory. But she never forgot, never stopped hoarding food, never could watch waste without flinching. The memory of Crystal City, of the refectory, of the American Guard throwing away the bruised orange, of the bread falling into trash, these remained vivid until the end. I would do anything for that. The phrase she whispered in 1944 became the summary of her wartime experience. 5 words that captured the complexity of survival, defeat, humiliation, and the strange gratitude of staying alive. She died in 1998, having outlived the war by 53 years. The memory of that discarded bread outlived her, preserved in her diary, in oral history interviews, in the documents donated to archives. It became part of the historical record, a small but significant piece of the vast documentation of how ordinary people experienced an extraordinary war. And it remains, for those who study this history, a reminder that war's consequences extend far beyond battlefield casualties, that psychological wounds can be as lasting as physical ones, and that sometimes the most devastating weapons are not bombs or bullets, but the simple demonstration of overwhelming abundance in the face of desperate scarcity. If this story of Tomiko and the untold complexities of war moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten voices and hidden histories to light. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and most importantly, leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. How do you think abundance and scarcity shape our understanding of conflict? Have your own family members shared similar stories of wartime contradiction? Your reflections add depth to these historical conversations, and we read every single comment. Thank you for watching, and for helping preserve these important memories.